I am Flavia Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Muhammed Suleiman. Muhammed is a PhD candidate at the University of Western Australia, and he was part of the Africa Moving the Boundaries 39th conference hosted by the University of Western Australia last week. Today we'll be discussing some issues about West Africa and Nigerian politics. Pleasure being with us.
Thank you.
Muhammed, could you please tell us how colonialism has affected the African continent and still affects Africa today?
Thank you, Flavia. Yes, I think your question is in two parts. First, how colonialism has affected Africa, and second, how it is still affecting the continent. Colonialism, just to answer your first question, has affected Africa enormously. As you know, all human societies have to go through stages of development. And when any of those stages is obliterated, is sort of it's not allowed to sort of go through that natural process of development, that has a lot of consequences. And to circumvent those consequences, it takes time for those issues to be resolved. To use the case of Nigeria from 1914 to 1960, about, say, 50-something years, if I'm not mistaken, it's a lot of time to sort of halt the development of a continent. I mean, a continent in charge of the people of that particular continent. So that is not to say that colonialism did not develop parts of Africa, of course. The administration developed certain parts of Africa, but Africans were not in charge. So that in itself affected the continent. But in 1950s, 1960s, when African countries started having independence, seeking and getting independence, it was an opportunity for Africans to reverse the damage done to the continent by colonialism. But again, they missed that opportunity. So instead of going back to what was African, they sort of internalized and entrenched those colonial policies that they had been subjected to for such a long period of time. So in the case of Nigeria, they built a federal state based on the colonial mentality of three regions of the country, because colonialism created the north, the south, the southeast, and then the western. So instead of, moving beyond that colonial arrangement, they founded another political structure on that system. So that was the second level of damage done to colonialism. And what that resulted in has been documented by a lot of scholars. Wars, ethnic secessions, irredentism, and boundary conflicts, and all of these things.
Absolutely, and the problem with tribalism as well just aggravates the whole tribal aspect in Africa.
With indirect rule, I'm from British West Africa, so I have more insights into the activities of Britain in West Africa than the French, but we can talk about French soon later. But indirect rule was a policy adopted by the British to rule parts of West Africa. It started in Nigeria, ruled out in countries like Ghana, and then in Kenya, and in other places in the continent. So they ruled the colonies through existing cultural norms. So what that did was it sort of gave autonomy to certain tribes and give power to certain tribes over other tribes. And that was a recipe for disaster post-independence. So yeah, tribalism in Nigeria, you have the Biafra War, being a direct result, the direct outcome of colonial policies in Britain. You have border dispute between Nigeria and Cameroon, English-French. You have in Ghana disputes between Ghana and Togo, English-French again, and you have many problems that came out of colonialism. But now, how colonialism is still affecting the continent is what is most controversial, because we have dealt with the impact of colonialism. That's very, very well documented. But there are so many ways colonialism is affecting the continent now, and that is because Africans have not yet moved away from the damages and the implications of autocratic colonial policies. That is the subject in itself.
Well, thank you so much, Mohammed. In your opinion, how the lack of clarity on historical and sociological issues in the African continent might aggravate the whole rhetoric towards jihadism in Africa, in West Africa, and compromising current policies in the region?
That's a good question. As you know, there has been many Africas. There has been the Africa that is ridden with diseases, Africa that is, chronically poor, and the African that is a continent of forever wars, and these sort of many Africas. Jihadism brings a new Africa in the 21st century after the attacks on the US in 2001, and this particular governance challenge, I call it a governance challenge, and you would know the reasons later. It's very unique, unlike the civil wars of the past, where you had Muslims and Christians both participating and taking governments to ransom. In this instance, it is almost completely Muslim in membership and in appeal. So that makes this problem quite unique. And that has sort of allowed a tendency to outsource the whole problem to the Middle East. And because these jihadists themselves make references to Osama bin Laden, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Boko Haram, by the way, currently is a province of the Islamic State. And they cite religious sources and Muslim Islamic authorities. It brings its own complications in dealing with the problem. Now, that has generated a tendency to misinterpret the problem. The tendency is that it is Middle Eastern in origin, it is purposefully anti-West, that its goal is just to get rid of Western culture in the region. Boko Haram, by the way, means Western culture is forbidden. That is the name of that term, Boko Haram. And also that it is Islamic, that Islam as a religion sanctioned it to some extent. And that sort of creates problems. What it does is that it disempowers local initiatives of dealing with the problem. It supports a misdiagnosis of the problem. It makes policymakers in Africa relax. It's, this is not a problem that is inherent to the African polity. It is a problem that is coming from elsewhere. It is purely ideological. It is purely religious. It has got nothing to do with political economy. It's got nothing to do with other things. It is just purely ideological. So what that has done, there are 4 variables in the ecology of jihadism. There is the historical, and these variables are present in the rhetoric of jihadists themselves in Africa, in Nigeria, and in Mali, for example, and even in Somalia, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. The historical is there, where they make references to past jihadist movements, past what we call, memories of bygone glories of Islam in the region. And secondly, there is the geopolitical, the place of Mali in relation to, for example, Libya. The proximity of the country to North Africa is also a factor. And then there is the socio-economic, the relative deprivation theory, the poverty, the governance issues, and there is also the ideological, the religious. So these are the 4 main variables. Now, what the outsourcing of the problem has done is that it has confused these variables. It is very hard to tell which of these variables is more important than the other. Which one do we prioritize? Where do we start from in trying to understand the problem? And that has serious implications for counter-terrorism policies. That has enormous implications. In the case of Nigeria, the over-reliance on ideology did not help allow Nigeria as a state to deal with Boko Haram for a very long time until the Chibok girls were kidnapped by Boko Haram. And that brought a lot of international pressure on the country, and that was when Nigeria started acting to get the girls back to safety. So these are some of the challenges that jihadism has brought to the continent, and these are how our misunderstanding of the problem is a result of perceptions emanating from the global north. Perceptions of jihadism elsewhere is changing, is affecting how we understand jihadism locally, and that is creating problems for how we respond to the threat.
Absolutely. So I'm just following up your answer, Muhammad. To which extent we can counter this Western approach to jihadism in West Africa and in the African continent? I mean, this approach that is simplifying a highly complex issue. What solution would you offer? How could we develop new perceptions that would promote a more accurate perception of what's taking place in Africa that would really represent the diversity of the political actors? What would you propose?
Yeah, a lot of things that can be proposed in these circumstances. Before that, though, this is a very difficult dilemma for Africa, because there are vested interests. There are interests of the United States in there. There are interests of other Western countries. It is very hard to really deal with it without being called a critical scholar for its sake. But I think the place to start is to call on policymakers in Africa to listen to critical scholars, to listen to people who have alternative views on jihadism, because you cannot just continue to listen to traditional ideas and traditional knowledge about the problem when indeed those traditional knowledges are not really solving the problem. You've got to listen to alternative views. I think that is a starting point. Also, given the fact that we have people who were in the past terrorists, Nelson Mandela was at some point a terrorist, but he came to be a diplomat par excellence, and Menachem Begin of Israel was at some point a terrorist too, but he then rose to become a prime minister of the country. I am not saying that Abubakar Muhammad Shekau should become the president of Nigeria.
that is a bit extreme.
That would be madness. But what I'm saying is, counter-terrorism policymakers in Africa should begin to take cognizance of what these terrorists are saying. Don't legitimize them. I believe they are not to be entertained in that sense, but listen to what they're saying. Not for the sake of their cause, but for the sake of understanding the problem in order to diagnose or in order to prescribe a proper solution to it. So that will be the second thing to do. The third thing will be to highlight the local conditions of these problems. I'm tempted to believe that jihadism is not any different from the rebel movements of the past in Africa. Jihadism is not too different from the RUF in Sierra Leone or rebel movements in Mozambique or in Liberia of the immediate post-Cold War era. The only difference is that jihadism is purely Muslim. Otherwise, the grievances, I'm tempted to believe, are similar. So we have to then try to understand how jihadism is different from our past violent political movements in the continent in order to be able to see how to respond. So this is another option. Another option would be to utilize local ways of responding to the problem. We Africans are a very communal community, a very, very communal society. Like I said at the conference, the Ubuntu concept, for example, the I am because we are aspect should be highlighted. I come from a conservative Muslim family, but in a predominantly Christian community. So Christmas to me was for all of us, and Eid was for all of us. I am not saying that people should compromise on their religious beliefs, no, but we've got to live in society together, and there are people who will be willing to point to authorities any strange behaviors, anything that is likely to jeopardize the security of society. So these sort of local ways of fomenting peace, local ways of dealing with a problem that affects all of us, because jihadism affects Muslims even more than Christians and non-Muslims generally. Jihadism, it's an affront to our peace. I mean, our peace as humanity, the human peace, and this sort of thing. So these are few on top of my head, the sort of things that we need to do to be able to respond to the problem of jihadism in the 21st century.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so much. And in your opinion, the Western and Eurocentric perceptions of the jihadist resurgence in Africa and this hegemonic approach to policy, do you think that it could also be aggravating local conflicts and even increasing the likelihood of radicalization?
Yes, to some extent, because there are a lot of implications if you misdiagnose a problem. If you have a fever and you are told that it is malaria in African context, that in itself can kill you. You know, so that is quite clear. So if you have a problem that is primarily local to the continent, but with a bit of an external influence, a little bit of an outward-looking identity, and you highlight that external identity of it at the expense of how local it is, it has a lot of implications. We should remember that jihadists, Muslim terrorists, if I should put it that way, survive on the idea that yes, the Westerners are coming to get us Muslims. They are just interested in obliterating the religion off the face of the earth. So any move that gives a slightest iota of credibility to that perception is good for the jihadist. And we should be very, 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 very careful in giving them that opportunity, giving them that credibility. So when critical scholars speak about the need to listen to alternative views, they're actually doing a service to how to deal with a problem. But when traditional scholars highlight a Western-centric idea about the problem, they're actually helping the jihadists, because you're actually giving fuel to the rhetoric of terrorists. So that must be made clear. And that has a lot of implications. When France went into Mali, one of the rhetorics of Ansar al-Din and Mujao there was that, and Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb was that, we told you that France is ruling this country. And it was all France is coming to get the Muslims, and it sort of legitimized the cause to some extent, even though that was not entirely true, but it sort of legitimized the cause. So yes, Western-centric approaches to understanding jihadism in West Africa have the potential to cause more extremism, because there is little knowledge among many Muslims, and in fact, as far as I'm concerned, it is little knowledge that is causing the rise of jihadism to start with. So when you're dealing with ignorant people, or people who have little knowledge about the religion itself, then you have to be very careful, because whatever you do, there is the tendency for them to misunderstand it. I recently attended a workshop where a counter-terrorism chief belonging to the African Union, I can't mention his name, mentioned that they were going to put surveillances in streets in some West African countries to make sure that people who set up madrasas, for example, madrasas are Islamic schools, who set up madrasas are not teaching the kids ideologies that will in the future become a threat to security. Fine, that is good. But in doing so, you've got to also understand that jihadism is not entirely a problem of setting up madrasas. Jihadism is more complex than that. But the challenge then will be, yes, I'm not denying the fact that people set up madrasas, and sometimes the things that people teach children are not entirely good for us. That is a fact. But say you target madrasas, and knowing very well that these madrasas are Muslim owned and it's Muslims who are there. You target them and you get rid of 3 madrasas. right there and then you have given a reason for a revolt. You have given these jihadists the message to pounce on, hey, they're now attacking the very means of training our children to be Muslim. So they now don't want our children to be Muslim. See, they're attacking our madrasas. And right there and then you have created a problem. I am not saying that this policy chief shouldn't take this approach. You should, but caution. We have to emphasize caution. We have to make sure that in this instance, dealing with jihadism is a rocket science. It has to be. It is not that simple. You have to take a purposive, methodical approach to deal with the problem. And that is the only way we can counter this Western-centric hegemonic understanding of the problem. That is the only way out. We cannot continue to recycle global war and terror narratives about terrorism in Africa. That is very, very problematic, and we will not get a solution out of that.
Well, wonderful, Muhammad. Fascinating talking to you, and very interesting to see that this discourse fomenting a dichotomy between East and West tends to create more problems, and there is a pressing need to establish cultural bridges and build relationships. Now, can you please explain to us which would be the best way to empower the African people, and particularly to empower African thinkers, so that possibly these cultural bridges and the relationship between West and East could go through a healthier road than the dichotomy East and West? Can you please just expand a bit more?
Yeah. I think you provide the answer right there. Building cultural bridges. We really have to understand that Africa is not an island unto of itself. Africa is part of the world, and Nigeria is part of Africa, and Africa is part of the global system. Terrorism in Nigeria has something in common with terrorism in the Middle East. No two ways about that. But the details of it, the local agency of these movements are different. So we have to share ideas, as far as I'm concerned. Christians and Muslims would have to begin to think together to solve a problem. Because Christians are victims, Muslims are victims, Jews are victims. People of all faith are victims of this problem. In the past civil wars, these same individuals were victims. So it is not a problem of Islam. It's not a problem of a particular faith. It is a problem of humanity, and we need to deal with it like that. Now, so building bridges, we have to share ideas. I think it will be very, very good for critical scholars, people who are bringing new alternatives to the table, to communicate with people with traditional views. We need to get the best of both worlds. What are traditional experts saying about the subject that is good, that will solve the problem? And what are critical scholars saying about the problem that will also help with dealing with the threat? We find a common position and then we deal with the problem. In the case of Africa, Africa has to understand its historical situation. You cannot understand Boko Haram, for example, without going back to British colonialism. You cannot understand Ansar Dine without, linking that to the over 600-year-old Tuareg secession movement in that part of Mali. The fact that the Tuareg movement was hijacked by Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb, that's bringing a certain Middle Eastern Islamic dimension to it. But we cannot overlook the history of that movement. So we need to understand that historical aspect of it. We also need to understand the socio-economic aspect of it. And we also need to understand the geopolitical aspect of it. But in all these understanding, various levels of understanding, we have to look for a common ground between established canons about terrorism in the 21st century and alternative views. What is it that the Rand Corporation or the Washington Institute or the Institute for the Near East are saying? What is it that they are saying that is good for us to use to deal with a problem? And what is it that other scholars, critical scholars like Richard Jackson and Zuleika and these other scholars, what are they saying that will also be good to deal with the problem? And then we have to indigenize that approach to suit the local condition of the African. And then we then have an African solution to the problem. There are, here at UWA, we have David Mikla, who is bringing a crop of young African scholars together and training them for this. And I think this is something we should do, we should encourage. African governments, Nigeria, Mali, should sort of send young, bright citizens of their countries to go and learn the scale of dealing with this threat. The fact that it's an African problem doesn't mean that we cannot learn from non-Africans, because they have a lot of expertise that we can tap into. And we don't have to be African African in the ethnic sense or in the cultural sense to be able to deal with the problem. We live in a human, globalized world, and there are a lot of non-Africans who have the African continent at heart, to some extent even more than some leaders that we have in Africa currently. So we should get ideas from these individuals. We should forge a common purpose. We should forge a common position to deal with the problem. So, simply put, the way to deal with the threat, the jihadist threat in Africa generally, is to go back to Kwame Nkrumah when he said, we should neither look east nor west, we should look forward. So that is how we deal with the problem.
Absolutely. Well, amazing talking to you, Muhammad. Now, only one final question. Taking into account the great diversity of the African continent, how we can foment greater dialogue within Africa so that bringing greater cohesion in the African continent, we might facilitate a greater dialogue between Africa and the West. What would you propose?
We should go back to the agenda of African unity. It's very, very important, because a United States of Africa is, to some extent, very, very impossible. We lost that opportunity in the 1950s when the decolonization process was yielding some fruits. And Nkrumah, for example, spoke against the Pakistanization of Nigeria when Nigeria got independence in 1960. His idea was Pakistan broke away from India, and that we shouldn't repeat that in Africa. He wanted unity. The North should stay together with the South and the West. So we lost the opportunity to actually unite the whole continent at that time. Now we can speak of a very loosed form of federation, like what we have in the European Union, for example, where there are a lot of common positions, and that empowers the continent together, and it allows the continent to share ideas among and between countries. I think that is what we should do. And when Nigeria is dealing with Boko Haram, we shouldn't think that it's a Nigerian problem. One of the impacts of the Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria is to weaken Nigeria's role in the region. Nigeria is a natural hegemon in the West African region. When the Liberian War started, and even in Sierra Leone, Nigeria played a very key role with ECOMOG in dealing with some of these problems. Now, the lion itself is under threat. I mean, who goes to save someone when there is a problem? So it put a lot of pressure on Ghana, for example, because if Nigeria is suffering and Nigeria is inactive, it's not able to deal with the problem, then Ghana, which is a small country but geopolitically a giant, to rise. But Ghana was also incapacitated. It has its own governance problems to deal with. So it shouldn't be a problem for Nigeria. And in Mali shouldn't be a Malian problem. It should be an African problem. I think that is what speaks to the idea of revisiting a united continent, a continent that is united in purpose in dealing with the challenges of the 21st century. Most of the challenges of the 21st century are overlap with the challenges of the 20th century. We haven't really solved all the problems of the last century, and now we have this new threat, which is in itself very, very unique and very, very damning to these local conditions of the African polity. So I think we need to forge cross-country interactions, cross-regional interaction. ECOWAS should work with the East African bloc, the North African bloc, the Southern African bloc, and the Central African bloc to work together to deal with the situation in Chad, work together to solve the problem in South Africa, work together to deal with the problems of the continent as a people. And I think that is the way forward. And one thing that I must emphasize is in doing so, we shouldn't forget that each of these countries are also different to some extent. So, in the same way that we understand that jihadism has a certain Middle Eastern aspect, but then the local intricacies of the problem are more important than those external influences. We should also understand that dealing with Islamism in Nigeria is entirely different from dealing with Islamism in Mali. All those aspects of the problem will have to be taken care of in order to come up with a system of response that is comprehensive, that is poised to deliver a response, an effective response to the problem.
Do you think there is any chance in the near future that Africa as a continent could become similar to what the European Union is, or a federation? Because I think that would be the best framework to have this coordination between plurality but still having unity. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it is possible. It is good to be very, very hopeful and very, very optimistic. But this is a question that I think there are a lot more people who are more qualified than myself to answer. I think David will be more than happy to answer that question for you. But yeah, it is very good to be very optimistic. And Africa is rising, no doubt about that. There are a whole lot of opportunities for the continent in this century than obviously the previous one. It is possible. And the fact that we had the AU, even though the AU itself is handicapped as much as the OAU was, but it is still a step forward towards unity. And if we keep working towards unity gradually, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not African unity now. It is African unity in the shortest possible time. So gradually we can get there. We cannot rule out African, but it looks as if it is the way forward now. That way, you give more African countries a lot of options to deal with some of these challenges, globalist challenges. One point that in Ghana, in the beginning of this year, 2 Guantanamo Bay detainees were just dumped in the country by the United States through a deal that raised a whole lot of controversies. Say there was a lot of communication between Ghana and other parts of Africa, or if this decision was made in relation to other countries or the AU or the ECOWAS, thinking about what are the implications of this. Because when the country is dealing with the United States, it is the continent that is dealing with the United States. So that dimension is there. So all these things would be better dealt with when there is a sense of unity. We cannot rule out unity, but it is not going to happen overnight.
Thank you so much, Muhammed. Fascinating talking to you. And thank you for being with us. For more information about the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia and our national office, please visit our website. Thank you once again for being with us.